Good evening, and welcome to another night of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we'll be exploring the forgotten world of lighthouse keepers. Those solitary guardians who once kept the coastal lights burning through storm and calm, guiding countless ships safely to harbor. I'm Ben, and I'll be your guide through this gentle journey into a way of life that has all but vanished from our modern world. As you settle in and make yourself comfortable, imagine the rhythmic sweep of light across dark waters, the constant symphony of waves against stone, the lonely silhouette of a tower standing tall against the elements. For centuries, these beacons of safety were tended by dedicated individuals who chose a life of isolation and routine in service to others, a life that few of us today could imagine enduring. Lighthouse keeping wasn't merely an occupation, it was a complete way of life, a commitment that encompassed every aspect of one's existence. The keeper's home was their workplace, their family, shared in their duties. Their days were governed by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the tides, and the endless needs of the light that must never go out. Tonight, we'll explore how these keepers lived, their daily routines, their challenges, their moments of peace and terror. We'll discover the evolution of their profession, from the earliest days of whale oil lamps to the final years before automation made their role obsolete. We'll hear tales of heroism during violent storms, of families raised in isolation, and of the psychological fortitude required to maintain sanity when the winter gales howled for weeks on end. This is not just a story of technical duties and mechanical operations. It's a human story of individuals who chose a path of service that demanded extraordinary sacrifice, of men and women who understood that their vigilance meant the difference between life and death for those at sea, of families who created homes in some of the most remote and challenging environments imaginable. So as you rest and prepare for sleep, allow yourself to be transported to a simpler yet harsher time, to stone towers and keepers' cottages, to oil lamps and foghorns, to a life dictated by duty, isolation, and the ever-present sea. This is how lighthouse keepers lived, the origins of lighthouse keeping. Long before GPS navigation and radar systems, before satellite mapping and digital charts, humanity relied on a much simpler yet remarkably effective system to guide ships safely through treacherous waters: the lighthouse. The history of these coastal sentinels stretches back into antiquity, to a time when maritime travel was both essential and extraordinarily dangerous. Perhaps the most famous of all ancient lighthouses was the Pharos of Alexandria, built in the 3rd century BCE on a small island in the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt. Standing over 330 feet tall, about the height of a 30-story modern building, this magnificent structure used an open fire at its summit to guide Mediterranean traders safely to one of the ancient world's busiest ports. For nearly 1600 years, the Pharos stood as a testament to human ingenuity, until earthquakes finally toppled it in the 14th century CE. It was so influential that the word for lighthouse in many languages, phare in French, pharo in Italian, derives from its name. Throughout the ancient world, from Rome to China, similar structures emerged wherever maritime trade flourished. These early lighthouses were typically maintained by slaves or servants who performed the exhausting task of carrying fuel to the summit and tending the fires throughout the night. Their lives were harsh, their work dangerous, and their contributions largely forgotten by history. As we drift forward through time to colonial America, we find the birth of lighthouse keeping as a formal profession. In 1716, the first American lighthouse was constructed at Boston Harbor. A sturdy stone tower rising 60 feet above Little Brewster Island, Boston Light still stands today, the oldest continually used lighthouse site in the United States, though the original structure was destroyed during the Revolutionary War and rebuilt in 17. The first keeper of Boston Light was George Worthylake, who moved to the island with his wife and daughter. Worthylake was paid a modest salary of £50 per year, approximately $12,000 in today's currency, to maintain the whale oil lamps that powered the light. Tragically, just 2 years into his service, Worthylake, his wife, and his daughter all drowned when their boat capsized as they were returning to the island. Their deaths were mourned throughout the colonies, with a young Benjamin Franklin even composing a poem about the tragedy called the Lighthouse Tragedy. As the young nation grew, so too did its network of lighthouses. By 1820, there were 55 lighthouses operating along America's coastlines. By 1860, that number had grown to over 400. Each required constant human attention. Keepers who would trim wicks, replenish oil, clean lenses, and ensure that the light never failed, regardless of weather or personal circumstance. Early lighthouse keeping was often a family affair. A keeper might be appointed to a remote location and bring along their spouse and children, all of whom would assist with the endless work of maintaining the light. Children grew up in these isolated towers and cottages, learning the trade from their parents, sometimes eventually taking over the position when their fathers or mothers grew too old to climb the tower stairs. The early light sources were primitive by today's standards. Open fires gave way to candles, which were replaced by oil lamps with reflectors. Whale oil was the preferred fuel until the 1850s, when lard oil and then kerosene became the standard. These early lamps required constant attention, wicks that needed trimming every few hours, glass chimneys that needed cleaning as soot accumulated, and fuel reservoirs that needed regular refilling. Imagine, if you will, the life of these early keepers. No electricity, no running water, no communication with the mainland except by boat. Supplies delivered perhaps once a month in good weather, less often in winter. The keeper's day governed entirely by the needs of the light and the safety of ships that might never even know their names. In these early days, before formal regulations, a keeper's duties were loosely defined but absolutely essential. They learned through experience and oral tradition, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. They became experts in weather prediction, maintenance of equipment, and the art of keeping a flame burning steadily through gale-force winds and driving rain. As maritime traffic increased throughout the 19th century, so too did the importance of these coastal beacons. Ships carrying valuable cargo and human lives depended entirely on the vigilance of these solitary figures, who kept watch through the night, ensuring that the light that guided them home never faltered. The life of these early keepers was one of paradox, tremendous responsibility, coupled with mundane routine, isolation interrupted by moments of terror during storms, the monotony of daily tasks, contrasted with the knowledge that their work saved countless lives. It was a calling that attracted a certain type of individual, self-reliant, detail-oriented, comfortable with solitude, and possessed of an unwavering sense of duty. As we continue our journey through the history of lighthouse keeping, remember these pioneers who established the traditions and practices that would define this unique profession for centuries to come. Their legacy lives on in the structures that still dot our coastlines, silent sentinels that once housed some of the most dedicated civil servants in American history. Becoming a lighthouse keeper. Not just anyone could become a lighthouse keeper. Throughout history, the process of selecting these guardians of the coast evolved significantly, reflecting the growing importance of their role in maritime safety and the increasing professionalization of the service. For most of the 19th century, lighthouse keeping positions were political appointments, a system that, as you might imagine, didn't always prioritize competence over connections. The local collector of customs would typically nominate individuals to the Secretary of the Treasury, who would then formally appoint each keeper. These collectors of customs, themselves political appointees, often used keeper nominations to repay political favors or settle debts of gratitude. Imagine, if you will, a remote lighthouse on a rocky promontory, miles from civilization. The safety of countless sailors and valuable cargo depended entirely on the diligence of whoever was appointed to tend that light. Yet that appointment might go to someone's cousin or a political supporter with no experience in maritime matters whatsoever. It's little wonder that in the early days, the quality of lighthouse keeping varied dramatically from station to station. By the 1850s, however, reform was in the air. The newly established Lighthouse Board, comprised of naval officers, engineers and scientists, began implementing standards and regulations that would transform lighthouse keeping into a true profession. They established basic qualifications that all keepers must possess. A lighthouse keeper should be between the ages of 18 and 50, young enough to handle the physical demands of the job, yet mature enough to shoulder its responsibilities. They needed to be literate, able to read and write sufficiently to maintain the detailed logs and records required of them. Simple accounting skills were necessary to track supplies and expenses. They had to demonstrate proficiency in handling boats, as many lighthouses were on islands or remote peninsulas where boat travel was the only means of access. Perhaps most importantly, keepers needed practical mechanical skills, the ability to maintain equipment, perform minor repairs, and improvise solutions when something broke down miles from the nearest hardware store or machinist. The appointment process became more rigorous as well. Nominations from collectors of customs were forwarded to the Lighthouse Board, which arranged interviews with each candidate. A 3-month probationary period was required before an appointment became permanent, a trial by fire, so to speak, that weeded out those unsuited to the peculiar demands of lighthouse life. In 1896, a significant change occurred when lighthouse keepers became members of the Federal Civil Service, removing them entirely from the political appointment process. Positions were now filled based on merit and qualifications rather than political connections. This professionalization of the service raised standards across the board and created a more consistent level of competence among keepers. The typical lighthouse had a hierarchy of positions. The principal keeper, sometimes called the head keeper, held overall responsibility for the station and its operation. At larger stations there might be one or more assistant keepers who reported to the principal keeper. The relationship between these individuals was crucial. Confined to close quarters and shared responsibilities, they needed to work together harmoniously, despite the stresses of isolation and the demands of their duties. Women, too, served as lighthouse keepers throughout American history, though their contributions have often been overlooked. Many initially took over positions after their husbands died or became incapacitated, but proved themselves every bit as capable as their male counterparts. Ida Lewis, keeper of the Lime Rock Light in Newport, Rhode Island, became famous for rescuing at least 18 people from drowning during her service. Margaret Norvell kept the light at the head of Passes Light in Louisiana for over 40 years, from 1891 to 1932, surviving hurricanes and floods while maintaining her duties impeccably. The life of a lighthouse keeper was not for everyone. The isolation alone deterred many. Imagine spending weeks or months with the same few people, or sometimes entirely alone, with only occasional contact with the outside world. The constant sound of waves and wind, the repetitive nature of the duties, the knowledge that a moment's negligence could cost lives, these factors created a psychological burden that not everyone could bear. Many keepers brought their families to live with them at the lighthouse. Children grew up in these unusual circumstances, sometimes receiving education by correspondence, sometimes attending schools on the mainland and boarding with relatives during the school year. Spouses often served as unofficial assistant keepers, learning all aspects of lighthouse operation and stepping in when needed. When the United States Lighthouse Service was absorbed into the Coast Guard in 1939, keepers who were then working had a choice. They could either retain their civilian status or become members of the Coast Guard with its military structure and discipline. After 1939, all newly employed individuals who worked with navigational aids were members of the Coast Guard, bringing a different culture and approach to lighthouse keeping. The keeper's uniform evolved over time as well. In the early days, there was no standard dress, but by the late 19th century, keepers wore navy blue uniforms with brass buttons and caps, bearing the Lighthouse Service insignia, a source of pride that reflected their status as federal employees performing an essential service. The compensation for this demanding lifestyle was modest but stable. Beyond their salary, keepers received housing for themselves and their families, a significant benefit, though the quality and comfort of that housing varied tremendously from station to station. Some lived in spacious keepers' cottages with relatively modern amenities, while others occupied cramped quarters within the lighthouse tower itself. For many who chose this path, the intangible rewards outweighed the hardships. There was pride in maintaining a perfect service record, in knowing that ships reached harbor safely because of their vigilance, in mastering the technical skills required to keep the complex equipment functioning properly. There was also a profound connection to nature, intimate knowledge of tides and weather patterns, spectacular sunrises and sunsets viewed from their towers, and the rhythm of seasons experienced with an intensity few others could know. As we continue our journey through the life of lighthouse keepers, remember that these were ordinary people who chose an extraordinary calling, one that demanded sacrifice, resilience, and unwavering commitment to duty. Their stories reflect a unique chapter in our maritime history, when the safety of those at sea depended entirely on the human element, on individuals who dedicated their lives to keeping the light burning through the darkest nights. Daily routines and responsibilities. The heart of a lighthouse keeper's existence was routine, a carefully choreographed sequence of tasks repeated day after day, season after season, year after year. Their primary duty, above all else, was elegantly simple yet profoundly important: to keep a good light. Everything else in their lives revolved around this central mission. Let's walk through a typical day in the life of a lighthouse keeper, beginning in the pre-dawn hours, when most of the world still slept. The keeper on night watch would have been awake through the darkest hours, vigilantly monitoring the light to ensure it burned steadily and brightly. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the real work of the day would begin. The morning routine started with extinguishing the light. This wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. The keeper would carefully lower the flame, clean the lamp, and prepare it for the coming night. For those tending a Fresnel lens, that magnificent invention of prisms and panels that revolutionized lighthouse optics, this morning ritual was particularly exacting. The lighthouse board's instructions for maintaining a Fresnel lens ran to 131 separate tasks. Imagine that, 131 distinct procedures just for one piece of equipment. The lens required meticulous cleaning to remove any soot, salt spray, or condensation that had accumulated overnight. Even the smallest smudge or speck of dust could diminish the light's effectiveness, potentially putting lives at risk. Using soft cloths, chamois leather, and special polishing powders, the keeper would clean each prism and panel of the lens, taking care not to scratch the delicate glass. This was not a task to be rushed. The rotating mechanism that turned the lens needed inspection and lubrication. The brass fittings required polishing to prevent corrosion from the salt air. Every surface had to gleam. With the light tended to, the keeper would move on to other morning duties. The lighthouse itself needed daily cleaning, sweeping floors, dusting surfaces, washing windows. The tower stairs, which might number 100 or more in taller lighthouses, had to be kept immaculate. Imagine climbing those stairs multiple times daily, carrying heavy containers of oil, tools, cleaning supplies, and other necessities. Weather observations were a critical part of the morning routine. Keepers maintained detailed logs of temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction and speed, cloud conditions, and visibility. These records, kept meticulously day after day, year after year, have provided invaluable historical climate data for modern researchers. If fog had rolled in overnight, or was expected, the fog signal equipment required attention. Early fog signals might be bells or cannons that needed manual operation. Later systems used steam whistles or compressed air horns that required their own complex maintenance routines. During periods of fog, which could last for days or even weeks in some locations, the keeper might need to activate the fog signal every few minutes, day and night, an exhausting responsibility that allowed little rest. Record keeping consumed a significant portion of a keeper's day. Every aspect of lighthouse operation had to be documented: fuel consumption, supplies used, maintenance performed, ships sighted, unusual occurrences. These logs were reviewed by lighthouse inspectors who visited periodically to ensure that standards were being maintained. A keeper's reputation rested on the thoroughness and accuracy of these records. Maintenance tasks filled much of the daylight hours. As James F. Sheridan, who grew up at the Saugatuck Light where his father was keeper, recalled, "Things that I remember mostly about his duties were, there seemed to always be a paintbrush in his hand. The government put great stock in painting. They painted, and they repainted, and they painted, until paint usually built up so it had so many coats there was no sharp edges at all anymore." This constant painting served a practical purpose beyond mere appearance. The harsh marine environment, with its salt spray, driving rain, and intense sunlight, quickly degraded untreated surfaces. Paint provided essential protection for the lighthouse structures, preventing rust, rot, and deterioration that could compromise the integrity of the building. Outside maintenance was equally important. The grounds surrounding the lighthouse needed regular attention. Paths kept clear, grass cut, vegetable gardens tended. Many lighthouses had outbuildings that housed fog signal equipment, storage for fuel and supplies, or workshops for repairs. All required regular inspection and maintenance. For island lighthouses, docks and boats demanded particular care. A well-maintained boat might be the keeper's only link to the mainland, and potentially their only means of rescue in an emergency. Ropes, sails, oars, and hulls all needed regular inspection and repair to ensure they remained seaworthy. Domestic chores filled whatever time remained. Meals had to be prepared, clothing washed and mended, living quarters cleaned. In lighthouses where families lived alongside the keeper, these tasks often fell to spouses and children, forming an unofficial but essential support system that enabled the keeper to focus on their official duties. As afternoon turned to evening, preparations for the night watch began. The lamp would be thoroughly checked, wicks trimmed, and oil reservoirs filled to capacity. The timing of the light's illumination was precisely scheduled based on sunset times, which varied throughout the year. Being even a few minutes late in lighting the lamp was considered a serious dereliction of duty. Maxwell Gertz, reflecting on his years at the Manitou Island Light, described the evening lighting ritual. "Oh, every day there was a man up there who had to check it out to make sure that the light operated properly, and that the lens were clean and all the brass. You had a lot of work on the inside." Once lit, the light required constant monitoring throughout the night. In lighthouses with rotating lenses, the clockwork mechanism that turned the lens needed to be wound at regular intervals, typically every few hours. Imagine climbing those tower stairs in the middle of the night, perhaps during a howling gale, to wind the mechanism that kept the light turning. At lighthouses with multiple keepers, the night watch was divided into shifts, typically 4 hours each. The keeper on duty would remain awake, checking the light regularly, monitoring weather conditions, and maintaining the fog signal if necessary. They might pass the time reading, writing letters, or working on small crafts or repairs, but always with one eye on the light. This routine, this endless cycle of cleaning, maintaining, recording, and watching, continued day after day, with little variation except that imposed by changing seasons or weather emergencies. Summer might bring additional tasks related to gardening and outdoor maintenance, while winter brought the challenges of keeping equipment functioning in freezing temperatures and storms. Leland L. Richards, who grew up at the Point of Bark Light during the 1920s, recalled the physically demanding nature of the work. When we had to take the kerosene out of there in 5-gallon cans and carry it all the way to the top of the lighthouse, that was something. That was really hard work. The monotony of this routine might seem oppressive to modern sensibilities. We live in a world of constant stimulation and endless variety. But for lighthouse keepers, routine wasn't just a necessity. It was a virtue. The predictability of their days provided structure in an otherwise unpredictable environment. The repetition of tasks allowed them to perfect their skills and take pride in their mastery. The rhythm of their duties connected them to keepers who had come before and would come after. In this life of routine and responsibility, lighthouse keepers found meaning. They understood that their seemingly mundane tasks, trimming wicks, polishing brass, keeping records, were all in service to a noble purpose, guiding mariners safely home. Every clean lens panel, every well-maintained piece of equipment, every accurate weather observation potentially saved lives. Living conditions in the lighthouse. The physical spaces lighthouse keepers called home were as varied as the coastlines they guarded. From towering stone structures perched on isolated rocks to more comfortable dwellings adjacent to the light tower, these unique living arrangements shaped every aspect of keeper life. Let's step inside a typical lighthouse keeper's quarters in the late 19th century. Space was almost always at a premium. In some of the earliest lighthouses, keepers and their families lived within the tower itself, occupying cramped circular rooms stacked beneath the lantern room. Imagine trying to fit furniture, beds, tables, chairs, storage into these curved wall spaces. Every item had to be custom built or adapted to fit the unusual dimensions. Later, lighthouse designs often included separate keepers' quarters, either attached to the base of the tower or as standalone cottages nearby. These provided more comfortable accommodations, but were still modest by any standard. A typical keeper's cottage might have 2 or 3 small bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor that doubled as a dining room, and perhaps a small office for maintaining the station's records. The physical comfort of these dwellings varied tremendously depending on their location, age, and design. Insulation was minimal by modern standards. Winter winds found every crack and crevice, making heating a constant challenge. Summer could bring stifling heat, especially in the lantern room, where the sun's rays were magnified by the glass panels. Heating came from wood or coal stoves, which required constant feeding during cold weather. Keepers at remote stations had to ensure their fuel supplies would last through winter when deliveries might be impossible. Imagine the anxiety of watching your woodpile dwindle during an unexpectedly harsh winter, knowing there was no way to get more until spring thaw. Fresh water was a precious commodity, particularly at offshore lighthouses. Many stations relied on rainwater collection systems, gutters that channeled rain from the roof into cisterns or barrels. This water had to be carefully rationed and used judiciously for drinking, cooking, and minimal bathing. During drought periods, water might need to be brought in by boat, adding another logistical challenge to the keeper's responsibilities. Bathing was infrequent by modern standards, often limited to once a week, using a portable tub set up in the kitchen where the stove provided warmth. The entire family would use the same bath water, starting with the adults and ending with the youngest children. The origin of the expression, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water." Lighting within the living quarters was basic, oil lamps or candles, until the early 20th century, when some stations were electrified. Keepers became experts at conserving lamp oil, often sitting in near darkness to save fuel. Reading, a common pastime, was typically done by the light of a single lamp around which family members would gather. Food preparation and storage presented unique challenges. Without refrigeration, keeping food fresh required ingenuity. Root cellars, spring houses, and cool ocean waters were used to preserve perishables. Salting, smoking, and drying extended the life of meat and fish. Many keepers maintained kitchen gardens when soil and climate permitted, growing vegetables to supplement their diets. Supplies were typically delivered by lighthouse tender ships, vessels specifically designed to service lighthouses. These deliveries might come only once a month, in good weather, less frequently during winter, or at particularly remote locations. Keepers had to carefully inventory and ration their supplies to ensure they would last until the next delivery. For families living at lighthouses, education was a significant concern. Children at mainland lighthouses might walk or row to the nearest school, sometimes boarding with relatives or friends during the school week. Those at more remote locations often received their education through correspondence courses or were taught by their parents. Books were precious resources, read and reread until they were memorized. Privacy was a luxury rarely enjoyed. Family members lived in close proximity, often sharing bedrooms. At stations with multiple keepers, unrelated individuals had to coexist in tight quarters, developing systems for sharing common spaces and respecting boundaries. The constant presence of others, combined with the inability to simply get away for a while, created psychological pressures that tested even the most compatible groups. The soundscape of lighthouse life was distinctive. There was the constant background of waves against the shore or structure, varying from gentle lapping to thunderous crashing during storms. Wind was an ever-present companion, whistling around corners and through any gap it could find. The mechanical sounds of the lighthouse itself, the clockwork mechanism of rotating lenses, the rhythmic ticking of equipment, the periodic blast of fog signals, created an auditory backdrop that became so familiar that keepers often noticed immediately when something changed or malfunctioned. Smells permeated these living spaces as well. The mineral scent of lamp oil, the mustiness of damp stone and wood, the salt tang of sea air, food cooking on the stove, laundry drying indoors during wet weather. In the lantern room, the hot metal, heated oil, and occasional whiff of smoke created a distinctive atmosphere that experienced keepers could interpret with remarkable precision, detecting problems by the slightest change in odor. Furniture was typically simple and functional. Government-issued pieces were supplemented with handcrafted items made by the keepers themselves during winter months or long periods of fog when outdoor work was limited. Many keepers developed considerable skill in woodworking, creating furniture perfectly adapted to their unusual living spaces. Personal belongings were kept to a minimum due to space constraints. When a new keeper was assigned to a station, they might be allowed to bring only a specified volume of personal effects. Everything else had to be sold, stored elsewhere, or given away. This enforced simplicity was difficult for many, but eventually became a way of life, focusing on what was truly necessary, rather than accumulating possessions. decorative touches reflected both the practical limitations and the creative spirit of lighthouse families. Shells collected from the beach, handmade quilts and needlework, pressed flowers and seaweed arrangements, photographs and small mementos. These modest embellishments transformed institutional spaces into homes. Many keeper families took particular pride in their parlors, keeping them meticulously arranged for the rare visitor or lighthouse inspector. The relationship between the lighthouse structure and the natural environment was intimate and sometimes adversarial. Storms that might be merely inconvenient elsewhere became life-threatening events at exposed lighthouses. Waves could crash against or even over the structures during severe weather. Wind could reach such force that it seemed the entire lighthouse might be torn from its foundation. During these extreme events, keeper families might retreat to the most secure part of the structure, sometimes spending days in a single room while the storm raged. The psychological impact of these experiences, the sound of waves striking with foundation-shaking force, the howling of wind that drowned out all conversation, the uncertainty of whether the structure would hold, cannot be overstated. Yet there were moments of transcendent beauty as well. Sunrises and sunsets viewed from the lantern gallery were spectacular. The play of light on water, the migration of whales and seabirds, the changing colors of the seasons. Lighthouse keepers experienced nature with an intimacy few others could match. Many developed a deep connection to their environments, becoming attuned to subtle changes that foretold weather shifts or seasonal transitions. This was home for the lighthouse keeper, not just a workplace, but the center of their existence. The boundaries between professional and personal life did not exist in any meaningful way. The light was always there, always demanding attention, always the priority. Families adapted to this reality, organizing their lives around the needs of the light, finding ways to create warmth. In these distinctive homes, generations of keepers maintained the lights that guided mariners safely to harbor. They raised children, celebrated holidays, mourned losses, and marked the passing of seasons, all while fulfilling their unwavering commitment to keep the light burning through fair weather and foul. Isolation and psychological challenges. Perhaps the most defining aspect of lighthouse keeper life, and certainly the most psychologically demanding, was isolation. The very purpose of lighthouses required them to be positioned in remote, often dangerous locations, on rocky outcroppings, isolated islands, desolate stretches of coastline far from population centers. This geographical isolation shaped every aspect of the keeper's experience and tested the mental fortitude of even the most resilient individuals. Imagine, if you will, spending months with the same 2 or 3 people, or sometimes entirely alone, with only occasional contact with the outside world. No casual conversations with neighbors, no trips to town for supplies or entertainment, no visitors dropping by unannounced, just the endless rhythm of waves against stone, the circling beam of light, and the repetitive tasks that filled each day. For keepers at offshore lighthouses, this isolation was particularly acute. Some stations might go weeks or even months without any contact from the mainland during winter, when storms made boat landings impossible. The keeper at Minot's Ledge Light off the coast of Massachusetts, for instance, was sometimes confined to the tower for a month or more, when waves completely submerged the base of the structure, making any departure impossible. Communication with the outside world was limited by technology and circumstance. Before the advent of radio, lighthouses communicated through visual signals, flags during daylight, light patterns at night, or relied on passing ships to carry messages. Some stations eventually received telegraph connections and later telephone lines, but these were often unreliable, especially during the storms when communication might be most crucial. Mail delivery was irregular and weather-dependent. Imagine waiting weeks for news from family, for responses to important questions, for information about world events. A letter might take months to reach an isolated station, its news already outdated by the time it arrived. This information drought created a peculiar form of psychological stress, a sense of being disconnected from the flow of human events, of life continuing elsewhere without your participation. The psychological impact of this isolation manifested in various ways. Some keepers developed elaborate routines to structure their days, finding comfort in the predictability of self-imposed schedules. Others turned to creative pursuits, writing, carving, painting, music, channeling their isolation into expression. Many became keen observers of nature, developing intimate knowledge of local wildlife, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. Not everyone adapted successfully. Lighthouse service records contain accounts of keepers who succumbed to what was sometimes called rock fever or island madness, psychological breakdowns triggered by prolonged isolation. Symptoms included paranoia, hallucinations, depression, and in rare cases violence toward themselves or others. When such situations occurred, relief keepers had to be dispatched immediately, often making dangerous journeys in adverse conditions to reach the affected station. The confined physical space of lighthouse living compounded the psychological challenges of isolation. Keepers and their families lived in close quarters, with little opportunity for privacy or personal space. Minor irritations that might be easily resolved in other contexts could fester and grow in the pressure cooker environment of a lighthouse. A small disagreement about household duties or a slightly annoying personal habit could escalate into serious conflict when there was no escape from one another's company. Donald L. Nelson, who served at the Quequinal Waterway Lower Entry Light between 1953 and 1955, recalled that one of the hardest aspects of the job was psychological rather than physical. The most difficult time, I think, was in the beautiful weather of July and August. There you were on the station, and everybody is out there boating by, in their cruisers, and enjoying themselves, and here you were, watch standing. This observation highlights another psychological challenge, watching others enjoy freedom while being bound by duty. On pleasant summer days, keepers might observe picnickers on nearby shores, boaters enjoying the water, travelers passing by, all experiencing the very location that for the keeper represented work and confinement rather than leisure. For families living at lighthouses, the isolation created unique challenges. Children often lacked playmates beyond their siblings. Spouses, particularly those who had not chosen the lighthouse life, but followed their partners into it, sometimes struggled with loneliness and the absence of social connections. Medical emergencies were particularly frightening, as help might be hours or days away. Winter brought the most intense isolation. At northern lighthouses, ice could make boat travel impossible for months. Storms might rage for days, confining everyone indoors. Darkness came early and lingered late, with only the keeper's lamp and whatever artificial light could be spared from precious fuel supplies to hold it at bay. These winter months tested psychological resilience most severely. Lighthouse keepers developed various coping mechanisms to manage isolation. Reading was perhaps the most common pastime, with books read and reread until they were practically memorized. The Lighthouse Service recognized this need and established a traveling library system in 1876, circulating boxes of books among stations. Each box contained about 40 volumes, a mixture of fiction, history, technical manuals, and religious texts, and would remain at a station for several months before being exchanged for a new selection. Handicrafts occupied many evening hours. Male keepers often became skilled woodcarvers, model ship builders, or scrimshaw artists. Women typically engaged in sewing, quilting, or knitting, practical skills that produced needed items while providing creative outlet. These handcrafted objects, many of which survive in museums today, offer tangible evidence of how keepers filled the long, quiet hours of their isolation. Music provided another escape from isolation. Many lighthouse families had at least one musical instrument, often a fiddle, accordion, or pump organ, and evenings might include singing or playing together. This musical tradition served both recreational and practical purposes. In foggy conditions, some keepers used distinctive songs or tunes to guide fishing boats safely to harbor when visual navigation was impossible. Letter writing became an art form for many keepers, who crafted detailed accounts of their daily lives to maintain connections with distant friends and family. These letters, when they eventually reached their destinations, provided a vital psychological lifeline to the outside world. Some keepers also kept extensive personal journals, recording not just official lighthouse business, but their observations, thoughts, and feelings, creating a written conversation with themselves when no other was available. The psychological demands of lighthouse keeping selected for certain personality types. Those who thrived tended to be self-sufficient, comfortable with their own company, detail-oriented, and possessed of what might be called an interior life, the ability to find meaning and satisfaction in thought, observation, and simple routines. They often developed a philosophical outlook, a capacity to find significance in their isolation, rather than merely enduring it. As one keeper wrote in his journal, there is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is imposed and unwelcome. Solitude is chosen and embraced. My task is to transform the former into the latter, to find in this isolation a kind of freedom that those on shore, bound by social obligations and constant distractions, might never know. This capacity to find meaning in isolation, to embrace the solitude rather than merely enduring it, was perhaps the most important psychological skill a lighthouse keeper could develop. Those who mastered it discovered a unique form of contentment in their unusual lives, a deep satisfaction in their essential service, and a connection to nature and the rhythms of the sea that few others would ever experience. In our modern world of constant connectivity and endless stimulation, the profound isolation of lighthouse keepers seems almost unimaginable. Yet in that very isolation, they found a clarity of purpose and a simplicity of focus that might hold valuable lessons for our distracted age. Recreation and leisure. Despite the demanding nature of their duties and the isolation of their posts, lighthouse keepers still found ways to fill their limited leisure time with activities that brought pleasure, stimulation, and occasional respite from their responsibilities. These moments of recreation were precious counterpoints to the rigorous routines that governed most of their waking hours. Reading was perhaps the most universal pastime among lighthouse keepers and their families. In an age before television, radio, or internet, books provided the primary window to the wider world. Recognizing this need, the Lighthouse Service established a traveling library system in 1876, circulating boxes of books among stations. Each box contained approximately 40 volumes, a carefully curated mixture of fiction, history, technical manuals, religious texts, and educational materials. When a new box of books arrived at a lighthouse, it was a momentous occasion. Imagine the excitement of unwrapping these treasures, discovering new stories and ideas after months of rereading familiar volumes. Keepers would often read aloud to their families in the evening, gathered around a single lamp to conserve fuel. Children learned to read from these shared books, sometimes becoming remarkably well educated, despite their isolation from formal schooling. Many keepers kept extensive journals, recording not just the official lighthouse business, but their personal observations, thoughts, and experiences. These journals, some of which survive in archives today, provide invaluable glimpses into the inner lives of these solitary figures. They wrote about weather patterns, unusual ships that passed, wildlife sightings, family events, and their own reflections on their unique way of life. Letter writing was another common activity, maintaining tenuous connections with distant friends and family. These weren't the brief notes we might dash off today, but lengthy, detailed accounts written over days or weeks to be sent whenever a supply boat or passing vessel might carry them to shore. Receiving mail was equally significant. Letters might be read repeatedly, shared aloud, and carefully preserved. Music brought comfort and entertainment to many lighthouse families. Instruments that could withstand the damp, salty environment were particularly valued. Accordions, fiddles, harmonicas, and small portable organs. Evening musicals helped pass the long hours of darkness, especially in winter when nights stretched interminably. Some keepers became quite accomplished musicians through years of self-directed practice. Singing was perhaps even more common than instrumental music, requiring no equipment and providing both entertainment and emotional release. Lighthouse families often knew dozens of songs, sea chanties, folk ballads, hymns, popular tunes, and would sing together while performing household tasks or during evening gatherings. Handicrafts occupied many evening hours, serving both practical and creative purposes. Male keepers often became skilled woodcarvers, fashioning everything from practical items like spoons and bowls to elaborate ship models and decorative objects. Scrimshaw, the art of carving designs on whale teeth or bone, was practiced by keepers with maritime backgrounds. These creations helped beautify the Spartan lighthouse interiors while providing creative satisfaction. Women typically engaged in textile arts, sewing, quilting, knitting, and embroidery. These weren't merely decorative pursuits, but essential skills that produced needed clothing, bedding, and household items. Many lighthouse families wore primarily homemade clothing, and their beds were covered with quilts pieced together during long winter evenings. The practical necessity of these crafts didn't diminish the creativity and artistry that went into them. For children growing up at lighthouses, play took creative forms, adapted to their unusual environment. Beaches became playgrounds, with shells, driftwood, and stones serving as toys. They learned to swim at early ages, built elaborate sand structures, and became keen observers of tide pools and marine life. Many developed collections, unusual shells, sea glass, interesting stones that reflected their intimate connection to their coastal environment. Lighthouse children often had unusual pets, injured seabirds nursed back to health, domesticated gulls that would eat from their hands, occasionally even seals that became accustomed to human presence. These animal companions helped alleviate the isolation that came from lack of interaction with other children. Gardening provided both recreation and practical benefit for many lighthouse families. Where soil and climate permitted, keepers maintained kitchen gardens, growing vegetables to supplement their diets. These gardens required constant attention to protect them from salt spray, harsh winds, and poor soil conditions. Some keepers became expert gardeners through years of trial and error, developing techniques specifically adapted to their challenging coastal environments. Flower gardens, though less practical, brought beauty and color to lighthouse grounds. Hardy species that could withstand coastal conditions, rugosa roses, beach peas, various grasses and sedges were cultivated around keepers' quarters. These gardens provided sensory pleasure and a creative outlet, while making the stark lighthouse grounds feel more like home. Fishing was both necessity and recreation for many lighthouse keepers. Fresh fish supplemented their often limited diets, while the act of fishing itself provided a welcome break from lighthouse duties. Keepers became intimately familiar with local fishing grounds, seasonal migrations, and the most effective techniques for catching different species. Some maintained their own boats specifically for fishing, while others fished directly from lighthouse structures or nearby shores. Board games and card games helped pass long evenings, especially during winter months when darkness fell early and outdoor activities were limited. Chess, checkers, dominoes, and various card games were lighthouse staples. These games provided mental stimulation, social interaction, and friendly competition. Some lighthouse families developed their own unique games, adapted to their environment, or created from available materials. Nature observation became a sophisticated pastime for many keepers. With years spent in the same location, they developed extraordinary knowledge of local wildlife, weather patterns, celestial movements, and seasonal changes. Many kept detailed records of bird migrations, marine mammal sightings, unusual weather phenomena, and astronomical events. This wasn't merely casual interest, but deep systematic observation that sometimes contributed valuable data to scientific understanding. Beachcombing after storms was both practical salvage and entertaining treasure hunt. Storms would wash up all manner of items, driftwood for fuel or crafts, fishing gear that could be repaired and reused, occasionally valuable cargo from shipwrecks. More commonly, keepers and their families collected shells, sea glass, and interesting flotsam that could be used for decoration or crafts. Holidays and special occasions were marked with particular care, their celebration helping to punctuate the otherwise repetitive rhythm of lighthouse life. Birthdays, anniversaries, and traditional holidays became important milestones, anticipated for weeks and commemorated with whatever special touches could be managed: a favorite meal, small handmade gifts, decorations crafted from available materials. Christmas was especially significant at many lighthouses. Keepers might spend months carving toys for children or creating other gifts. Decorations were often handmade from natural materials: evergreen boughs, dried berries, shells, and sea stars. The holiday meal would include whatever delicacies could be preserved from the last supply delivery or special items saved specifically for the occasion. For some lighthouse families, religious observance provided both spiritual comfort and structured activity. Bible reading was common, as were family prayers and hymn singing. At mainland lighthouses, keepers might occasionally attend church services in nearby communities, but those at offshore or island stations created their own religious routines. Sunday was often observed as a day of rest from all but essential duties, with special meals and clothing marking it as distinct from work days. Photography became a pastime for some keepers in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. As cameras became more accessible, they documented their unusual homes, dramatic weather events, passing ships, and family milestones. These photographs, many of which survive in historical collections, provide invaluable visual records of lighthouse life that complement written accounts. The recreational activities of lighthouse keepers were shaped by their environment, their isolation, and the limited resources available to them. Yet within these constraints, they created rich interior lives and found genuine pleasure in simple pursuits. Their leisure activities reflected a capacity for self-reliance, creativity, and finding joy in the natural world that surrounded them. In our modern world of endless entertainment options and constant stimulation, there might be something to learn from the lighthouse keeper's approach to leisure, the deep satisfaction found in simple pleasures, the creativity born of limited resources, and the rich experiences available when we slow down enough to truly observe the world around us. Technological evolution. The story of lighthouse keeping is also a story of technological evolution, a fascinating progression from primitive open fires to sophisticated automated systems. This evolution not only transformed the physical nature of lighthouses, but also fundamentally changed the keeper's role and eventually led to the profession's decline. Let's begin at the beginning, with the earliest light sources. The first lighthouses used open fires fueled by wood, coal, or other combustible materials. Imagine tending such a fire atop a tower during a storm, the wind threatening to extinguish the flames, rain or snow, making the fuel damp and reluctant to burn, the constant danger of the fire spreading beyond control. These early lighthouse keepers were essentially fire tenders, engaged in a constant battle against the elements. By the 18th century, candles had replaced open fires in many lighthouses. Multiple candles were arranged in chandeliers or circular frames to increase brightness. While this represented an improvement in safety and consistency, candles required constant attention. Wicks needed trimming, melted wax had to be managed, and the light output remained relatively weak. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the widespread adoption of oil lamps in lighthouses. Initially, whale oil was the preferred fuel, particularly spermaceti, a high-quality oil from sperm whales that burned cleanly and brightly. A keeper's duties now included maintaining these lamps, cleaning glass chimneys darkened by soot, trimming wicks to prevent smoking, and ensuring a steady supply of oil to the burner. As whale populations declined and prices rose, alternatives were sought. Lard oil came into use in the 1840s, followed by mineral oils like kerosene in the 1870s. Each new fuel required keepers to learn new techniques and safety precautions. Kerosene, while effective and economical, was highly flammable, adding new dangers to the keeper's work. Perhaps the most revolutionary development in lighthouse technology was the Fresnel lens, invented by French physicist Augustin Fresnel in 1822. Before this innovation, lighthouses used reflectors, curved metal surfaces behind the light source that directed the beam outward. These were inefficient, with much of the light lost or misdirected. The Fresnel lens changed everything. It consisted of a central magnifying lens surrounded by concentric rings of prisms, each precisely angled to capture light from the lamp and project it outward in a concentrated beam. This ingenious design dramatically increased a lighthouse's range and brightness while using the same amount of fuel. For keepers, the Fresnel lens brought new responsibilities and skills. These complex glass structures required meticulous maintenance. As mentioned earlier, the lighthouse board's instructions for maintaining a Fresnel lens included 131 separate tasks. The lens had to be cleaned daily with special cloths and polishing powders, taking great care not to scratch the delicate glass. Any fingerprints, salt spray, or dust could diminish the light's effectiveness. Many lighthouses featured rotating lights that produced distinctive flashing patterns, crucial for mariners to identify specific lighthouses. Early rotation mechanisms were powered by clockwork systems that needed to be wound regularly, sometimes as frequently as every 2 hours. Imagine climbing the tower stairs multiple times during the night to wind these heavy mechanisms, especially during storms when the light was most needed. Later systems used floating baths of mercury to reduce friction in the rotation mechanism. Effective, but introducing the hazard of mercury exposure to keepers' already dangerous work. The health effects of long-term mercury exposure weren't well understood at the time, but many keepers likely suffered from its toxic effects. Fog presented a particular challenge for lighthouse operation, rendering the light itself nearly useless. Various fog signal technologies developed over time, each requiring specific keeper skills. Early fog signals included bells, gongs, and even cannons that needed manual operation, sometimes requiring keepers to remain awake for days during extended fog events, striking bells or firing cannons at regular intervals. Steam whistles came into use in the mid-19th century, followed by compressed air horns and sirens. These systems required keepers to maintain boilers, compressors, and other machinery, adding mechanical engineering to their growing list of required skills. During fog events, which could last for days or weeks in some locations, the constant sound of these powerful signals created a physically and psychologically taxing environment. Communication technology gradually reduced the isolation of lighthouse life. Telegraph lines reached some mainland lighthouses in the late 19th century, allowing keepers to report emergencies, receive weather warnings, and maintain contact with supervisors. Radio technology, introduced in the early 20th century, further connected lighthouses to the wider world and provided crucial safety communication with ships. For keepers, these communication advances meant learning new skills, Morse code, radio operation, and maintenance, weather reporting protocols. The ability to communicate during emergencies saved countless lives, but also increased the responsibilities and expectations placed on keepers. Electricity transformed lighthouse operation when it began to be introduced in the late 19th century. The first electric lighthouse light in the United States was installed at the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in North Carolina in 1870, using an arc lamp powered by a generator. The light was dramatically brighter than oil lamps, but the technology was initially unreliable and expensive. By the early 20th century, electric lighting became more common in accessible lighthouses. Keepers now needed to understand electrical systems, maintain generators, and troubleshoot problems. Many stations operated hybrid systems for years, using electricity when possible, but maintaining oil lamps as backups for inevitable power failures. Power generation presented its own challenges. Remote lighthouses couldn't connect to electrical grids and required on-site generation. Diesel generators became common, requiring keepers to develop skills in engine maintenance and repair. Fuel management became critical, ensuring adequate supplies for extended periods, especially at locations where winter weather might prevent deliveries for months. The path to automation began in the early 20th century, with the development of acetylene gas systems that could operate unattended for weeks or months. These used sunlight-activated valves that would turn the light on at dusk and off at dawn, and could be designed to create flashing patterns without human intervention. Radio beacons, introduced in the 1920s, transmitted signals that ships could detect with radio direction finders, providing navigation guidance even in conditions of zero visibility. These systems required less constant attention than traditional lights, but added new maintenance responsibilities for keepers. The development of solar power and battery technology in the mid-20th century accelerated automation. Photovoltaic panels could charge batteries during daylight hours, powering lights and fog signals through the night and during cloudy periods. Solid-state electronics replaced mechanical systems, increasing reliability and reducing maintenance needs. By the 1960s and 1970s, many lighthouses were being converted to fully automated operation. Lights were controlled by photocells that activated at dusk. Fog detectors automatically triggered signals when visibility dropped. Remote monitoring systems alerted maintenance personnel to problems. The human element, the keeper who had been essential for centuries, was increasingly viewed as unnecessary. For the keepers who remained as automation spread, the nature of their work changed dramatically. They became more like technicians than traditional keepers, monitoring electronic systems, performing preventive maintenance, and troubleshooting increasingly complex equipment. Many found this transition difficult, missing the hands-on nature of traditional keeping and the deep connection to the light itself. Maxwell Gertz, reflecting on the changing technology at Manitou Island Light, noted, "We had 2 big air compressors in the engine room. That was for the foghorn, and then there was 3 generators and a big bank of batteries. So all those machinery had to be serviced, and oil had to be changed constantly, plus the light had to be maintained. Oh, every day there was a man up there who had to check it out to make sure that the light operated properly." The final phase of lighthouse automation came in the 1980s and 1990s, when advanced electronic systems made even periodic human presence unnecessary at most stations. Lights, fog signals, radio beacons, and later GPS transmitters could all function automatically, with maintenance personnel visiting only occasionally for inspections and repairs. The last officially staffed lighthouse in the United States was the Boston Light, which Congress mandated must remain staffed even after all others were automated. It finally lost its full-time keepers in 1998, though it still receives Coast Guard personnel who serve as tour guides and perform maintenance, a symbolic nod to the human tradition of lighthouse keeping. This technological evolution represents more than just changing equipment. It reflects humanity's relationship with the sea and our approaches to safety and navigation. Each innovation solved problems but created new challenges. Each advance made shipping safer but altered the keeper's role. The progression from open fire to automated LED lights spans centuries but tells a continuous story of human ingenuity applied to the ancient problem of guiding mariners safely home. For the keepers who lived through these transitions, technological change was a double-edged sword. New equipment made their work easier, in some ways but more complex in others. It connected them to the wider world, but ultimately made their profession obsolete. They were the last practitioners of an ancient tradition, witnessing its transformation and eventual end. Today, when we visit preserved historic lighthouses, we can see this technological evolution frozen in time. Fresnel lenses still in place, oil rooms with their specialized equipment, foghorn buildings with their massive compressors. These artifacts tell the story not just of changing technology, but of the keepers who mastered each new system, adapted to each innovation, and maintained these life-saving beacons through centuries of technological transformation. Dangers and heroism. The romantic image of the lighthouse keeper often centers on moments of danger and heroism. Solitary figures standing firm against raging storms, rescuing shipwreck victims from churning seas, maintaining the light through the most harrowing conditions. While daily life consisted primarily of routine maintenance and mundane tasks, these extraordinary moments of danger and courage were very real, forming a significant part of lighthouse keeper history. The physical dangers faced by lighthouse keepers were numerous and ever-present. The structures themselves, often built on precarious locations specifically chosen for their exposure to the elements, could be hazardous environments. Tall towers with narrow winding staircases became treacherous when wet or icy. Keepers climbed these stairs multiple times daily, often carrying heavy supplies of oil, tools, or water. Falls were common and sometimes fatal, particularly in remote locations where medical help was days away. Imagine climbing a 150-foot spiral staircase in complete darkness during a power failure, with hurricane-force winds causing the entire structure to sway perceptibly, knowing that one misstep could be your last. This was not an unusual experience for keepers at exposed coastal or island stations. The equipment keepers worked with presented its own dangers. Oil lamps could cause fires or explosions if improperly handled. The early electrical systems were often rudimentary and hazardous by modern standards. Mercury, used to float the rotating mechanisms of some lights, posed serious health risks not fully understood at the time. Machinery for fog signals, steam boilers, air compressors, engines could malfunction catastrophically. Weather created perhaps the most dramatic dangers. Lighthouses, by their very nature, were positioned to face the full fury of storms. Waves could strike with such force that they shattered the glass of the lantern room, even at heights that seem impossibly far above sea level. During particularly severe storms, keepers sometimes had to take shelter in lower portions of the structure, emerging periodically to check on the light despite the risk. The Minot's Ledge Light off the coast of Massachusetts provides a sobering example of these dangers. The original structure, completed in 1850, was built on iron pilings over a submerged rocky ledge. During a tremendous gale in April 1851, the entire lighthouse collapsed into the sea, with 2 keepers inside, both of whom perished. The replacement lighthouse, a massive stone tower completed in 1860, was engineered to withstand such storms, but still experiences waves that completely submerge its base during severe weather. Isolation compounded these dangers. When injuries or illnesses occurred, medical help was often far away. Keepers developed practical medical skills out of necessity, setting broken bones, treating burns, delivering babies, and handling whatever emergencies arose. They maintained medical supplies and basic pharmaceuticals, often making do with limited resources when professional care was unavailable. The psychological pressure of knowing that help might be days or weeks away, that you were ultimately responsible, not just for the light, but for the safety and health of everyone at the station, created a unique form of stress. Keepers had to remain calm and resourceful in emergencies, making critical decisions without the luxury of consultation or second opinions. Beyond the dangers to themselves, keepers faced the moral burden of witnessing maritime disasters they were often powerless to prevent. Despite the presence of the lighthouse, ships still ran aground, particularly during storms or fog. Keepers might watch helplessly as vessels broke apart on rocks, their crews struggling in the water beyond reach. Yet when rescue was possible, lighthouse keepers frequently demonstrated extraordinary heroism. Many keepers and their families risked their own lives to save shipwreck victims, rowing small boats into dangerous surf, throwing lines to those in the water, or wading into frigid seas to pull survivors to safety. Ida Lewis, keeper of the Lime Rock Light in Newport, Rhode Island, became nationally famous for her rescue efforts. Over her 39-year career, she saved at least 18 people from drowning, rowing her small boat through dangerous conditions to reach those in distress. Her first rescue occurred when she was just 16 years old, and her last recorded rescue came when she was 63. Lewis received numerous awards and commendations, including the Gold Life-Saving Medal, the highest honor given by the United States Life-Saving Service. Abby Burgess Grant, who tended the Matinicus Rock Light off the coast of Maine, became renowned for her dedication to duty during a particularly severe storm in 1856. Just 16 years old at the time, she was left in charge of the light when her father, the keeper, went to the mainland for supplies. A violent storm prevented his return for nearly a month. During this time, Abby not only maintained the light, but also cared for her invalid mother and younger siblings, moving them to the safety of the lighthouse tower when waves threatened to destroy their dwelling. She rationed their limited supplies and kept both lights burning throughout the ordeal, potentially saving countless lives at sea. Marcus Hanna, keeper of the Cape Elizabeth Light in Maine, holds the distinction of being the only person to receive both the Medal of Honor for his Civil War service and the Gold Life-Saving Medal. In January 1885, during a violent winter storm, Hanna spotted the schooner Australia wrecked on the rocks near his lighthouse. Despite the freezing temperature, high winds, and dangerous surf, he made his way to the vessel and rescued 2 crewmen who would otherwise have perished. These stories of heroism weren't limited to the keepers themselves. Their family members often participated in rescues or maintained the light during emergencies. Children as young as 12 or 13 sometimes took over lighthouse duties when parents were incapacitated or engaged in rescue efforts. Spouses frequently served as unofficial assistant keepers, stepping in during crises with skill and courage equal to their partners. The Lighthouse Service recognized exceptional acts of bravery with various honors and commendations. The Gold and Silver Life-Saving Medals, established in 1874, were awarded for extraordinary heroism in rescue operations. Efficiency stars and letters of commendation acknowledged keepers who maintained perfect service records under difficult conditions. These recognitions were deeply valued by recipients, representing peer acknowledgement of their dedication and courage. Beyond formal recognition, lighthouse keepers operated according to an unwritten code of duty that transcended official regulations. They understood that their vigilance directly impacted human lives, that a moment's negligence or a decision to prioritize personal safety over the light could result in maritime disaster. This sense of responsibility created a culture where extraordinary effort and personal risk was simply considered part of the job. The keepers' logbooks, maintained at every lighthouse, contain matter-of-fact entries that hint at the dangers and occasional heroism of their profession. A typical entry might read, January 15, 1892. Gale force winds from NE. Waves breaking over landing. Glass broken in lantern room. Repaired temporarily with spare pane. Light maintained throughout night. Rescued 3 men from capsized fishing boat. 1 deceased. Bodies of 2 others not recovered. Weather clearing toward morning. The understated nature of these accounts reflects the keeper's mentality. Dramatic events were recorded with the same clinical precision as routine maintenance or weather observations. Heroism wasn't celebrated, but simply noted as part of the job's requirements. Not all dangers came from the natural environment. During wartime, lighthouses often became strategic targets. During the Civil War, Confederate forces damaged or destroyed numerous lighthouses to hinder Union naval operations. Keepers who remained at their posts faced potential capture or violence. Similarly, during World War II, coastal lighthouses operated under blackout restrictions and faced potential attack from enemy submarines or saboteurs. The isolation that defined lighthouse life created its own dangers during conflicts. Keepers might be unaware of approaching threats or changing military situations. Some found themselves suddenly on the front lines of conflicts they barely understood, forced to make difficult decisions about whether to abandon their posts or remain at risk. Even in peacetime, lighthouses occasionally faced human threats. Smugglers, pirates, and criminals sometimes targeted isolated lighthouses, knowing that help was far away and keepers had few defenses. Most keepers were armed, but their primary focus remained the light rather than self-protection. There are accounts of keepers defending their stations against armed intruders while simultaneously maintaining the light, extraordinary demonstrations of their commitment to duty. The dangers faced by lighthouse keepers have largely vanished with automation. Modern navigational aids operate without human presence, maintained by occasional visits from Coast Guard personnel or contractors. The heroism of keepers who risked their lives to save others or maintain the light through impossible conditions has become part of maritime history rather than ongoing reality. Yet something valuable was lost in this transition, a tradition of service and sacrifice that represented the best aspects of human dedication to duty. The lighthouse keeper standing watch through a raging storm, climbing the tower despite exhaustion and danger, rowing out to save strangers from drowning. These images resonate because they speak to our capacity for courage and selflessness in the face of overwhelming natural forces. As we drift towards sleep, let us remember these solitary figures who faced danger with quiet resolve, who understood that their vigilance meant the difference between life and death for those at sea, and who embodied a tradition of service that deserves to be remembered even as the technology that required their presence has evolved beyond them. Supplies and logistics. The seemingly simple task of keeping a lighthouse supplied with necessities was, in reality, a complex logistical challenge that required careful planning, resourcefulness, and occasional improvisation. For keepers at remote stations, the management of supplies could mean the difference between comfort and hardship, or in extreme cases, between life and death. Most lighthouses received their major supplies via lighthouse tender ships, vessels specifically designed and operated by the lighthouse service to deliver provisions, fuel, equipment, and personnel to lighthouse stations. These ships followed regular routes, visiting each lighthouse on a predetermined schedule that might range from monthly visits for accessible locations to just once or twice a year for the most remote stations. The arrival of the tender was always a momentous occasion. Imagine the anticipation as the ship appeared on the horizon after months of isolation. For keepers and their families, the tender brought not just essential supplies, but also mail, news from the outside world, perhaps new books or magazines, and brief but precious human contact with the crew. The actual transfer of supplies from ship to lighthouse was often a challenging operation, particularly at offshore stations where docking facilities might be minimal or non-existent. In favorable weather, small boats would shuttle between the tender and the lighthouse landing, carrying crates, barrels, and packages. During rough conditions, creative methods were employed. Supply baskets might be transferred via cable systems, or in extreme cases, waterproof containers might be floated ashore. Leland L. Richards, who grew up at the Pont-au-Barque Light during the 1920s, recalled the annual supply delivery. Once a year the lighthouse boat, it was the Aspen, the Amaranth, or the Marigold, stopped out there about 2 miles. They didn't dare come any closer, and they loaded everything into their small boats with the crew loading it. Once delivered, supplies had to be inventoried, organized, and properly stored. Keepers maintained detailed records of everything received and consumed. These inventory records were scrutinized during inspector visits, with keepers held accountable for any discrepancies. The meticulous nature of this record-keeping reflected both the government's concern for efficiency and the practical reality that accurate inventory management was essential when the next delivery might be months away. The annual requisition process required keepers to anticipate their needs with remarkable precision. Maxwell Gertz remembered that would be fuel, that would be paintbrushes, paint, soap that was needed, toilet paper, you could name it, everything that you'd use at home, plus all the engines, all the necessary lubricating oils, all the gasoline that was used for the boat. Well, you could name anything, and it had to be. We'd have a record of that. Imagine trying to calculate exactly how many pounds of flour, sugar, coffee or salt your family would need for the next 6 months, or how many gallons of lamp oil would be required to keep the light burning through long winter nights. A miscalculation could mean running short of essentials with no way to obtain more until the next scheduled delivery. Fuel for the light was the most critical supply. In the days of oil lamps, keepers had to ensure they had sufficient quantities of whale oil, lard oil, or kerosene to maintain the light continuously through all conditions. The Lighthouse Board established precise formulas for calculating fuel requirements based on the type of light, hours of operation, and seasonal variations in darkness. The kerosene alone, as Leland Richards noted, filled the oil house, and the oil house is 10 or 12 feet in diameter and higher than this room, about 8 feet. So you know, it had shelves all the way around. See, it was round, and they'd put the kerosene in there. Transporting this fuel from storage to the lantern room was one of the keepers' most physically demanding tasks. And then, of course, when we had to take the kerosene out of there in 5-gallon cans and carry it all the way to the top of the lighthouse, that was something. That was really hard work, Richards recalled. Imagine climbing a spiral staircase of perhaps 100 steps or more, carrying a 5-gallon can, weighing over 30 pounds, repeating this journey multiple times per week. Water was another critical resource that required careful management. Some lighthouses had wells or springs, but many relied on rainwater collection systems, gutters that channeled rain from the roof into cisterns or barrels. During drought periods, water might need to be brought in by boat, adding another logistical challenge. Keepers became experts at water conservation, developing techniques for washing, cooking, and cleaning that used minimal amounts. Food supplies required particular attention. Staples like flour, sugar, coffee, tea, salt, and preserved meats could be stored for extended periods, but fresh foods were harder to come by. Many lighthouse families maintained kitchen gardens when soil and climate permitted, growing vegetables to supplement their diets. These gardens required considerable effort to establish and maintain in harsh coastal environments, often involving the importation of soil and the construction of windbreaks to protect tender plants. Fishing provided another important food source, with many keepers becoming skilled anglers out of necessity rather than recreation. Game hunting was common at mainland stations, with keepers harvesting deer, rabbits, and wild birds when in season. Gathering wild foods, berries, mushrooms, edible plants was also practiced at stations where such resources were available. Food preservation was an essential skill. Without refrigeration, keeping food from spoiling required traditional techniques like salting, smoking, pickling, and canning. Lighthouse families typically processed and preserved seasonal abundance for use during leaner times. A successful berry harvest might be transformed into jams and preserves that would last months. Fish caught during summer abundance would be smoked or salted for winter consumption. Root cellars, spring houses, and cool ocean waters were used to extend the life of perishables. In winter, ice might be harvested and stored in sawdust-insulated ice houses, providing limited refrigeration during warmer months. These traditional preservation methods required considerable knowledge and skill, passed down through generations of keepers. Medical supplies were another critical consideration. Lighthouse stations maintained basic first aid materials and common medications, but for serious illnesses or injuries, professional medical care might be days or weeks away. Keepers and their spouses often developed practical medical skills out of necessity, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, delivering babies, treating common illnesses. Medical reference books were standard items in lighthouse libraries, consulted whenever unfamiliar symptoms or injuries occurred. Maintenance supplies and spare parts were essential to keep the light functioning properly. Keepers needed tools, lumber, glass, metal parts, paint, and other materials to perform repairs and routine maintenance. The remoteness of many stations meant that improvisation was often necessary, fashioning replacement parts from available materials or adapting tools for unusual purposes. Clothing and textiles required particular attention in the harsh marine environment. Salt air and moisture quickly degraded fabrics, While the physical nature of lighthouse work meant clothing wore out rapidly, mending and repurposing were constant activities. Many lighthouse families made their own clothing, with sewing, knitting, and other textile skills being essential rather than merely decorative pursuits. Books and educational materials were considered essential supplies rather than luxuries, particularly for families with children. The Lighthouse Services Traveling Library Program, established in 1876, helped address this need by circulating boxes of books among stations. Still, keepers often requested specific educational materials to support their children's learning, especially at remote stations where formal schooling was impossible. Communication supplies, paper, ink, pens, envelopes, stamps, maintained tenuous connections with the outside world. Letter writing was the primary form of communication for most lighthouse families, with correspondence sometimes waiting weeks or months for transport to the mainland. Official communication with supervisors required proper documentation and record keeping, adding another layer to the keeper's paperwork responsibilities. Emergency supplies required special consideration. Keepers maintained reserves of essential items, food, water, fuel, medical supplies, to sustain them through periods when regular deliveries were impossible due to storms or other disruptions. These emergency caches were carefully managed and replenished, with keepers constantly balancing current needs against potential future emergencies. For island or offshore lighthouses, boats were essential equipment rather than mere transportation. They provided the only link to the mainland for supplies, medical emergencies, or communication. Maintaining these vessels in seaworthy condition was a critical responsibility. Keepers needed supplies of paint, caulking, rope, canvas, and tools specifically for boat maintenance, along with fuel for motorized vessels. The bureaucratic aspects of supply management were surprisingly complex. Keepers maintained multiple record books, inventory logs, consumption records, requisition forms, receipt documentation. Annual reports required accounting for virtually every item used at the station, both as a record of past activity and to determine what supplies would be needed for the next season. Winter preparations were particularly important at northern lighthouses, where ice and storms might cut off access for months. Fall supply deliveries were carefully calculated to last through the winter isolation period, with extra margins for unexpected circumstances. Fuel, food, and medical supplies received special attention, with keepers often requesting additional quantities, just in case. The logistical challenges of lighthouse supply created a culture of resourcefulness and frugality among keepers and their families. Nothing was wasted. Items were repaired rather than replaced whenever possible. Materials were repurposed creatively. Empty oil cans became containers or were cut into tools. Worn clothing was transformed into quilts or rugs. Packing crates became furniture or building materials. This careful stewardship of resources wasn't merely practical necessity, but became a point of pride for many keepers. Their ability to maintain comfortable lives and keep the light burning perfectly despite limited supplies and isolation demonstrated their competence and self-reliance. The lighthouse supply system, with all its challenges and limitations, helped shape the unique character of those who chose this unusual way of life, resourceful, prepared, and capable of finding sufficiency in what others might consider scarcity. Community relations. While isolation defined much of lighthouse life, keepers and their families were not entirely disconnected from the broader communities around them. The relationship between lighthouse stations and nearby towns or villages was complex and evolved over time, shaped by geography, necessity, and changing social dynamics. For mainland lighthouses situated near towns or fishing villages, integration with the local community was often substantial. Keepers might attend local churches, their children might attend local schools, and families could participate in community events and social gatherings. These connections provided important social outlets and practical support networks that helped balance the demanding nature of lighthouse duties. In these settings, the lighthouse itself often became a community landmark and source of local pride. Residents might check the light each evening, noting with approval its punctual illumination, or expressing concern if it seemed dimmer than usual. The keeper, as the lighthouse's custodian, often enjoyed a position of respect within the community, a government official with an essential role in local maritime safety. Lighthouse children faced particular challenges in community integration. At mainland stations within walking distance of schools, they might attend regular classes, though often facing long and sometimes hazardous journeys regardless of weather. Emily Fish, keeper of Point Pineau's Light in California from 1893 to 1914, insisted that her granddaughter make the daily 2-mile walk to school in Pacific Grove, believing that education and social interaction were essential despite the inconvenience. For more remote stations, educational arrangements were more complicated. Children might board with relatives or friends in town during the school year, returning to the lighthouse for holidays and summer breaks. This separation was emotionally difficult for families, but considered necessary for proper education. Some lighthouse families chose homeschooling instead, with parents, often mothers, taking on teaching responsibilities using correspondence courses and materials provided by the lighthouse service. For island or offshore lighthouses, community connections were more tenuous, but no less important. Keepers might make weekly or monthly trips to the nearest town for supplies, mail, and social interaction. These visits were eagerly anticipated breaks from isolation, chances to catch up on news, attend to business matters, and briefly experience normal social life before returning to their solitary posts. Local fishing communities often developed special relationships with nearby lighthouses. Fishermen relied on the lights for navigation and safety, while keepers frequently depended on fishermen for informal communication, emergency assistance, and occasional fresh supplies between official deliveries. These mutual dependencies created bonds that transcended formal relationships. The economic relationship between lighthouses and local communities was significant. Keepers purchased supplies from local merchants when possible, providing reliable if modest business. During construction or major repairs, lighthouses created temporary employment for local workers. In some locations, lighthouse tourism began even while stations were still operational, with keepers providing informal tours to curious visitors, creating another small economic benefit for isolated communities. Lighthouse inspectors, who visited periodically to evaluate conditions and keeper performance, created another community connection. These officials brought news, mail, and sometimes special supplies or equipment. Their visits were both anticipated and dreaded, a break in routine, but also a time of scrutiny and evaluation. Inspectors often stayed in local inns or boarding houses, creating another small economic link between the lighthouse and nearby towns. For lighthouse children, community interactions were precious opportunities for normal childhood experiences. Emily Moore, who grew up at several lighthouse stations, recalled, "When we went to town, it was like going to a different world. We'd see other children playing games we didn't know, wearing clothes different from ours. We were shy at first, but so eager for friendship that we quickly overcame it." These children often developed unusual social adaptability, able to transition between the isolated, adult-oriented world of the lighthouse and the more conventional social environments they encountered in towns. Many former lighthouse children recall this dual existence as both challenging and enriching, providing them with perspectives and resilience that served them well in later life. Healthcare represented another crucial community connection. While keepers maintained basic medical supplies and developed practical first aid skills, serious illnesses or injuries required professional care. Relationships with local doctors were important, though the logistics of bringing medical help to remote lighthouses or transporting patients to town could be extremely challenging, especially in adverse weather. Some communities developed specific protocols for lighthouse medical emergencies. Signal flags or light patterns might indicate urgent medical needs, prompting local authorities to dispatch assistance. In coastal Maine, for instance, a system of doctor boats evolved, vessels specifically designated to transport physicians to island communities and lighthouses during emergencies. Religious observance created another community connection. When possible, lighthouse families attended services at local churches, valuing both the spiritual guidance and social interaction these visits provided. For more isolated stations, visiting clergy occasionally made special trips to conduct services, perform baptisms or marriages, or provide spiritual counsel. These visits were significant events, often mentioned prominently in keeper logs and family letters. Many lighthouse families maintained religious practices independently when community worship was impossible. Sunday observances might include Bible reading, hymn singing, and special meals that marked the day as distinct from the work week. These practices connected them spiritually, if not physically, to broader religious communities. Education created important community bonds, particularly as Lighthouse children grew older and required more advanced schooling than parents could provide. Arrangements with mainline schools, boarding situations with community families, and eventually sending older children to live with relatives for high school education, all created connections that extended the Lighthouse family's network beyond their isolated station. The Lighthouse service recognized the importance of education and sometimes made special arrangements to facilitate it. In some regions, Lighthouse tenders would transport children to and from schools at the beginning and end of terms. Lighthouse inspectors might carry educational materials, books, or correspondence course materials as part of their regular visits. Perhaps the most dramatic community interactions occurred during emergencies. Lighthouse keepers often served as de facto emergency responders for their regions, particularly in remote coastal areas with limited official services. They might be the first to spot ships in distress, forest fires, or other emergencies, using their communication equipment to alert authorities. During storms or natural disasters, mainland lighthouses sometimes became community gathering points or emergency shelters, their solid construction providing safety when other buildings failed. Keepers might take in stranded travelers, shipwreck survivors, or local residents whose homes were damaged or threatened. These emergency services further cemented the lighthouse's role as a community resource beyond its navigational function. As communication technology improved, many lighthouses became important communication nodes for their regions. Those equipped with telegraph or later telephone connections might serve as contact points for entire communities, receiving and relaying messages, weather warnings, or emergency information. This communication role was particularly important in remote areas where the lighthouse might have the only reliable connection to the outside world. Community celebrations occasionally included lighthouse families, particularly for major holidays or local festivals. These rare opportunities for socializing were eagerly anticipated. Keepers' logs and family letters often mentioned Christmas parties in town, 4th of July celebrations, or local harvest festivals as highlights of the year, brief but precious chances to feel part of normal community life. The relationship between lighthouses and Native American communities deserves special mention. Many lighthouses were built on lands traditionally used or inhabited by indigenous peoples, creating complex interactions. In some regions, positive relationships developed, with Native Americans providing valuable local knowledge, assistance during emergencies, or even serving as keepers themselves. In other areas, tensions or misunderstandings characterized these interactions, reflecting broader societal conflicts. As lighthouse keeping evolved from a political appointment to a professional civil service position, the community standing of keepers generally increased. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lighthouse keepers were widely respected as dedicated public servants performing essential work under difficult conditions. Their children, though sometimes viewed as unusual due to their isolated upbringing, were generally welcomed into community schools and activities when they could participate. The gradual automation of lighthouses in the mid-20th century significantly altered these community relationships. As keeper positions were eliminated, the human connection between lighthouses and communities diminished. Lighthouses transformed from living, working facilities with resident families to automated structures visited only occasionally by maintenance personnel. Many communities mourned this transition, recognizing that something valuable was lost when the keeper's family no longer occupied the lighthouse, the station that had been a small but vital part of community life, contributing children to local schools, business to local merchants. Assistance during emergencies became simply a navigational aid without human presence or community connection. Today, many former lighthouse stations have been preserved specifically because of community efforts. Local historical societies, preservation groups, and concerned citizens who recognize the historical and cultural value of these structures and the way of life they represented. These preservation efforts reflect the enduring connection between lighthouses and their communities, a relationship that evolved from practical necessity to historical appreciation and cultural heritage. The story of lighthouse keepers is, in many ways, a story of finding balance between isolation and community, of maintaining essential connections while living at the margins of society. Their unique position, both separate from and connected to nearby communities, created a distinctive social dynamic that shaped the lighthouse keeping experience for generations. Donald Nelson, who served at several lighthouses during this transitional period, reflected, "The job was changing. We were becoming more like engineers than lighthouse keepers. The romance was fading, replaced by circuit boards and maintenance schedules. Some of the old-timers couldn't adapt. They'd spent decades trimming wicks and polishing lenses, and suddenly they were expected to understand electronics." By the 1960s, automation had become sophisticated enough that even major coastal lighthouses could operate reliably without permanent keepers. Lights were controlled by photocells that activated at dusk. Fog detectors automatically triggered signals when visibility dropped. Remote monitoring systems alerted maintenance personnel to problems. The human element, the keeper who had been essential for centuries, was increasingly viewed as unnecessary. The process of automation wasn't uniform across all lighthouses. Remote or difficult to access locations were automated first, as these presented the greatest logistical challenges for staffing and supply. Lighthouses near population centers or with historical significance often retained keepers longer, sometimes more for tradition than operational necessity. For lighthouse communities, automation brought significant changes. The keeper's family had often been integrated into local life. Their children attended schools, they purchased supplies from local merchants, they participated in community events. When keeper positions were eliminated, communities lost these connections. The lighthouse transformed from a living, working facility with resident families to an automated structure visited only occasionally by maintenance personnel. Many communities resisted automation, recognizing that something valuable would be lost when the keeper's family no longer occupied the lighthouse. Local historical societies, preservation groups, and concerned citizens advocated for maintaining the human presence, arguing that keepers provided services beyond merely tending the light: weather reporting, emergency response, assistance to mariners in distress. The economic impact of automation extended beyond the keepers themselves. Support industries, the lighthouse tender ships and their crews, supply providers, administrative staff, saw reductions as fewer manned lighthouses meant decreased logistical needs. Coastal communities that had provided services to lighthouse families lost that small but steady economic contribution. For the keepers and their families, automation meant the end of a way of life. Many had been lighthouse keepers for generations, fathers passing the profession to sons, families moving from station to station over decades of service. The specialized knowledge they had developed, understanding the peculiarities of specific lights, knowing local weather patterns and maritime traffic, maintaining traditional equipment, suddenly became obsolete. The human cost of this transition is reflected in the stories of the last generation of lighthouse keepers. Some retired early rather than adapt to the changing technology. Others transferred to different Coast Guard positions. A few became the caretakers of automated lights, living nearby and checking the equipment regularly, but no longer responsible for the minute-by-minute operation that had defined traditional keeping. Maxwell Gertz, who witnessed this transition firsthand, noted with a mixture of resignation and nostalgia, "Progress marches on, I suppose. The automated lights are more reliable, more consistent, but something is lost when you remove the human element, the judgment, the dedication, the sense of personal responsibility. A machine can keep a light burning, but it can't care about that light the way we did." By the 1980s, automation had transformed most of America's lighthouses. The last officially staffed lighthouse in the United States was the Boston Light, which Congress mandated must remain staffed even after all others were automated, a symbolic acknowledgement of the historical and cultural significance of lighthouse keeping. It finally lost its full-time keepers in 1998, though it still receives Coast Guard personnel who serve as tour guides and perform maintenance. The transition wasn't limited to the United States. Around the world, lighthouse authorities followed similar paths toward automation, though at different paces. Some countries maintained staffed lighthouses longer due to different economic considerations, stronger traditions, or geographical challenges. The last manned lighthouse in the United Kingdom, for example, was automated in 1998, marking the end of a tradition that dated back to Roman times. The technological advances that made lighthouse keepers obsolete, ironically, helped preserve their legacy. The same electronic and digital technologies that automated lighthouses now allow us to record, preserve, and share the stories of lighthouse keeping. Former keepers have been interviewed, their experiences documented. Logs, journals, and photographs have been digitized and made accessible to researchers and the public. The physical structures themselves have been preserved as historic sites, museums, and even unique accommodations. This preservation effort reflects a recognition that lighthouse keeping represented something valuable beyond its practical function, a tradition of service, a unique way of life, a direct connection to maritime history that resonates even in our digital age. The dedication required to maintain a light through storm and calm, the isolation endured to ensure others' safety, the quiet heroism of daily duty, these aspects of lighthouse keeping continue to captivate our imagination. Today, the profession of lighthouse keeping exists primarily in memory and historical record. The lights still shine, now powered by LED bulbs and solar panels, controlled by computerized systems that require only occasional maintenance. The foghorns still sound, triggered automatically by visibility sensors. The structures still stand, maintained not for their keepers but for their navigational function and historical significance. Yet something intangible was lost in this transition, a human connection to maritime safety that had existed since ancient times. The keeper who knew every sound of their lighthouse, who could sense approaching weather changes, who took personal pride in maintaining a perfect service record, this figure has passed into history, replaced by circuits and sensors that perform the same function without the same meaning. As we drift towards sleep, let us remember these final generations of lighthouse keepers, the ones who witnessed the end of a tradition, who saw their lifetime of specialized knowledge rendered obsolete by technology, who represented the conclusion of a profession that had guided mariners safely to shore for centuries. Their story is not just one of technological obsolescence, but of changing values, efficiency and automation, replacing human vigilance and dedication. In the soft darkness, as you listen to these words, imagine the last keeper climbing the tower stairs one final time, checking the automated systems that would replace them, taking a last look at the view from the gallery, and then closing the door on centuries of tradition, the light still shining, but no longer under human watch. Cultural legacy and mythology. Long after the last keeper turned off the final lamp, lighthouses and their keepers continue to occupy a special place in our cultural imagination. These towering structures and the people who tended them have inspired literature, art, film, and folklore, creating a rich cultural legacy that extends far beyond their practical function as navigational aids. In literature, lighthouses have served as powerful symbols and evocative settings. Virginia Woolf's modernist masterpiece To the Lighthouse uses the structure as both a physical destination and a metaphorical beacon, representing human connection and aspiration. In children's literature, numerous stories feature lighthouse settings, often emphasizing themes of courage, responsibility, and the wonder of living between land and sea. Lighthouse keepers themselves have been immortalized in countless novels, memoirs, and historical accounts. These narratives often emphasize the keeper's isolation, dedication, and occasional heroism, qualities that resonate with readers even as the profession itself has vanished. The lighthouse keeper has become an archetypal figure representing solitude, duty, and resilience in the face of natural forces. Visual artists have been equally captivated by lighthouses and their keepers. From the dramatic seascapes of Winslow Homer to Edward Hopper's iconic lighthouse at Two Lights, these structures have provided compelling subjects for painters seeking to capture the meeting of human construction and natural power. The visual contrast of the vertical lighthouse against the horizontal expanse of sea and sky creates compositions of striking balance and tension. Photography has preserved the image of lighthouse keeping for posterity. Historical photographs of keepers at their stations, families posed before their unusual homes, and dramatic images of lighthouses withstanding fierce storms provide visual documentation of this vanished way of life. Modern photographers continue to be drawn to lighthouses, now capturing them as historical monuments rather than working facilities. Cinema and television have frequently featured lighthouses as settings for drama, mystery, and romance. The visual power of these structures, combined with their isolated locations and association with danger, makes them natural backdrops for storytelling. Films like The Light Between Oceans explore the psychological effects of lighthouse isolation, while others use these settings for ghost stories, mysteries, or tales of forbidden love. Documentaries have played a crucial role in preserving lighthouse history, recording the testimonies of former keepers and their families before these first-hand accounts were lost. These films capture not just the technical aspects of lighthouse operation, but the emotional and psychological dimensions of keeper life, the pride in service, the challenges of isolation, the unique rhythms of days governed by light and darkness. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of lighthouse cultural legacy lies in folklore and supernatural tales. Few man-made structures have generated as rich a mythology as lighthouses. Their liminal position, standing at the boundary between land and sea, civilization and wilderness, seems to invite supernatural association. Their isolation and the mysterious quality of their lights shining through darkness and fog further enhances their mystical qualities. Ghost stories abound at lighthouses across the world. Many involve keepers who died in the line of duty, but continue their vigilance beyond death, unwilling to abandon their posts, even after their physical lives have ended. Others feature phantom lights that appear when the actual lighthouse is dark, often interpreted as warnings or attempts by spirits to prevent disasters. The Seguin Island Light in Maine is said to be haunted by the wife of a 19th century keeper who, driven mad by isolation and the constant playing of the same piano tune by her husband, was murdered along with the piano. Visitors report hearing phantom piano music when no instrument is present. At Point Lookout Lighthouse in Maryland, numerous apparitions have been reported, including uniformed keepers still performing their duties and the spirits of Civil War soldiers who died at a hospital once located nearby. St. Augustine Lighthouse in Florida has perhaps the most active reputation for hauntings, with reports of children's laughter, mysterious footsteps on the tower stairs, and shadowy figures seen in and around the keeper's quarters. These are often associated with the tragic drowning of the lighthouse builder's daughters during construction in the 1870s. Beyond specific hauntings, lighthouses have developed a rich symbolic language in our cultural mythology. They represent guidance, hope, steadfastness, and safety. The image of a lighthouse beam cutting through darkness and fog has become a powerful metaphor for clarity and direction in confusing or troubled times. Religious traditions have adopted lighthouse imagery to represent spiritual guidance, while educational and therapeutic organizations use it to symbolize knowledge and healing. The lighthouse keeper, too, has become a cultural archetype, the solitary watcher, the dedicated guardian, the individual standing firm against overwhelming natural forces. This figure resonates even in our crowded, connected modern world, perhaps because it represents qualities and experiences increasingly rare in contemporary life: solitude, singular purpose, direct connection to natural rhythms, and work with immediate, tangible importance. The preservation movement for historic lighthouses represents another dimension of their cultural legacy. When automation threatened to leave lighthouse structures abandoned or demolished, community organizations, historical societies, and preservation groups mobilized to save them. Today, hundreds of historic lighthouses have been preserved as museums, interpretive centers, or unique accommodations, allowing visitors to experience something of the keeper's life. The National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000 created a systematic process for transferring decommissioned lighthouses to public entities and non-profit organizations committed to preservation. This legislation recognized the cultural and historical significance of these structures beyond their navigational function, ensuring that future generations would have access to this tangible maritime heritage. Lighthouse tourism has become a significant cultural and economic phenomenon. Millions of visitors each year climb tower stairs, tour keepers' quarters, and learn about the history of these fascinating structures. Lighthouse enthusiasts, sometimes called lighthouse baggers or phorologists, travel extensively to visit and photograph different lights, collecting experiences much as others might collect stamps or coins. This tourism has economic benefits for coastal communities, but also serves an important educational purpose, keeping lighthouse history alive and accessible. Many preserved lighthouses are staffed by knowledgeable volunteers, often including descendants of keepers or former Coast Guard personnel with direct experience of lighthouse operation. These interpreters provide a human connection to lighthouse history that enhances the visitor experience beyond what informational displays alone could achieve. The stories of lighthouse keepers continue to be collected and preserved through oral history projects, memoirs, and historical research. Organizations like the United States Lighthouse Society and similar groups worldwide maintain archives, publish journals, and support research that documents this vanished profession. These efforts ensure that the specialized knowledge, daily experiences, and personal stories of keepers are not lost as the last generation with direct experience passes away. Digital preservation has created new opportunities to share lighthouse history. Virtual tours allow people who cannot physically visit remote lighthouses to experience these structures. Online archives make historical photographs, keeper logs, and other primary sources accessible to researchers and the general public. Social media communities connect lighthouse enthusiasts worldwide, sharing information and advocating for preservation. The enduring fascination with lighthouses and their keepers reveals something about our relationship with technology and progress. As our world becomes increasingly digital, automated, and disconnected from physical reality, there seems to be a growing appreciation for the tangible, the mechanical, and the directly purposeful. Lighthouse keeping represented a profession where actions had immediate visible consequences, where human vigilance directly saved lives. Perhaps this explains why, even as the practical need for human lighthouse keepers has vanished, our cultural interest in them has only grown. They represent a connection to maritime history, certainly, but also to values and experiences that seem increasingly rare. Dedication to duty, self-reliance, intimate knowledge of local environments, and work that required both technical skill and moral commitment. The mythology and cultural legacy of lighthouses continue to evolve. Modern artists, writers, and filmmakers find new meanings in these structures and the people who once tended them. Environmental concerns have added another dimension to lighthouse symbolism, with these structures now sometimes representing humanity's relationship with fragile coastal ecosystems and rising sea levels. Yet at the core of lighthouse mythology remains the keeper, that solitary figure climbing the tower stairs at dusk, trimming the wicks, polishing the lens, and ensuring that the light that guides others to safety never fails. This image resonates across time and cultural changes, speaking to something fundamental about human dedication and our capacity to care for one another, even at great personal cost. As we drift towards sleep, let these cultural echoes of lighthouse keeping remind us of the enduring power of simple dedication to purpose. Though the profession itself has passed into history, the values it embodied, vigilance, responsibility, resilience, remain as guiding lights for our own lives, beacons that help us navigate our personal darkness and find safe harbor in challenging times. Conclusion. As our journey through the world of lighthouse keepers draws to a close, let us take a moment to reflect on this unique way of life that has now largely vanished from our world. The lighthouse keeper, that solitary figure who maintained the beacons that guided countless mariners safely to harbor, represents a tradition of service, dedication, and resilience that still resonates in our modern age. We've explored how these keepers lived, their daily routines of cleaning, maintaining, and vigilance. We've discovered the challenges they faced: isolation, harsh conditions, dangerous storms, and the constant pressure of knowing that lives depended on their unwavering attention to duty. We've learned about the evolution of lighthouse technology from simple fires to automated LED lights, and how this progression eventually rendered the human keeper obsolete. But beyond these practical aspects of lighthouse keeping, we've glimpsed something more profound, a way of life defined by purpose and simplicity. Lighthouse keepers lived lives stripped of many distractions and complications that characterize our modern existence. Their days were governed by natural rhythms, the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the tides, the progression of seasons. Their work had immediate tangible importance. The light they maintained directly saved lives and protected property. Perhaps this explains our continuing fascination with lighthouse keepers, long after automation has made their profession obsolete. In our hyper-connected world of constant stimulation and virtual experiences, there is something compelling about the keeper's life, the direct connection between action and consequence, the intimate knowledge of a specific place and its moods, the focus on a single essential task. The qualities that made a good lighthouse keeper: reliability, attention to detail, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and a capacity for solitude, remain valuable in any era. The keeper's ability to find meaning in routine, to maintain vigilance without constant supervision, to take pride in work well done regardless of recognition. These represent timeless virtues that transcend the specific context of lighthouse keeping. For the families who shared this unusual life, lighthouse keeping created a unique legacy. Children who grew up in these remote stations often developed remarkable self-sufficiency, creativity in making their own entertainment, and deep appreciation for nature. Many former lighthouse children have described how this unusual upbringing shaped their character and values throughout their lives, teaching them resilience, adaptability, and the ability to find contentment with simple pleasures. The spouses who supported lighthouse keepers, often serving as unofficial assistant keepers themselves, demonstrated extraordinary adaptability and fortitude. They created homes in challenging environments, educated children without formal schools, maintained social connections despite isolation, and developed practical skills ranging from medicine to mechanics. Their contributions, though often unrecognized in official records, were essential to the functioning of the lighthouse system. As technology advanced and automation spread, the human element of lighthouse keeping gradually faded away. The last keeper to climb the tower stairs, the last log entry recording weather conditions and ships passed, the last family to make a home in the keeper's quarters. These represent the end of a tradition that stretched back centuries. Yet the legacy of lighthouse keeping lives on in preserved structures, historical records, and the cultural mythology that surrounds these coastal sentinels. Today, when we visit a historic lighthouse, climb its winding stairs, and look out from the gallery at the vast horizon, we connect with this legacy. We can imagine, if only briefly, what it might have been like to be responsible for that light, to know that its beam cutting through darkness and fog meant the difference between safety and disaster for those at sea. This imaginative connection helps us appreciate the dedication of those who came before us, and perhaps inspires us to consider our own relationship with duty, service, and purpose. The lighthouse itself has become a powerful cultural symbol, representing guidance, hope, steadfastness, and safety. The image of a lighthouse beam cutting through darkness has become a metaphor for clarity and direction in confusing or troubled times. Even as their practical importance has diminished with GPS and modern navigation systems, lighthouses retain their symbolic power and emotional resonance. As we conclude our exploration of how lighthouse keepers lived, perhaps we can take with us some of the wisdom embedded in their way of life, the value of focused attention, the dignity of necessary work, the capacity to find richness in simplicity, and the quiet heroism of doing one's duty without fanfare or recognition. In our often fragmented and distracted modern lives, these qualities shine like a beacon, offering guidance toward a more centered and purposeful existence. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine once more that solitary keeper, climbing the tower at dusk, trimming the wicks, polishing the lens, and lighting the lamp that will shine through the darkness. Think of the ships that will navigate safely because of this simple act of duty. Consider the lives saved, the cargoes protected, the families reunited because someone stood watch through the night, keeping the light burning steadily against the darkness. In this image lies the essence of lighthouse keeping, not just a historical profession, but a testament to our human capacity for vigilance, service, and care for those we may never meet, but whose safety we hold in our hands. As the light sweeps across the water and your consciousness drifts toward dreams, carry with you this legacy of the lighthouse keepers, those quiet guardians whose dedication illuminated the way home for countless travelers on dark and dangerous seas.